A poor boy enters a luxury restaurant and is humiliated by a young millionaire in front of everyone. Without mercy, the man forces him to sing as a form of entertainment, provoking cruel laughter. But the boy's voice silences the room and brings tears to strangers' eyes. What seemed like humiliation transforms into an unforgettable moment and changes his destiny forever. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching. From We Continue, I promise this will be the best story you'll hear in your life. The light drizzle didn't stop Michael from crossing the streets of New York that night. With his 10 years, frail body, and worn-out clothes, he firmly held the hand of Annie, his 7-year-old sister, who coughed incessantly. The little girl's high fever hadn't broken for 3 days, and the home remedies prepared by Mrs. Clare, their blind mother, were no longer working. "Hang on just a little longer, Annie. We'll get some food," whispered Michael, swallowing his own fear. Mrs. Clare had taught her children to be strong, even when the world seemed to be falling apart. Since losing her vision in an accident 5 years ago, and her husband abandoning them soon after, she raised her children with the little she earned selling handicrafts. But the money from the last few days had been used to buy Annie's medicine, and now there was nothing left to feed them. Fifth Avenue shone with its lights and shop windows. Michael observed, fascinated and intimidated, that universe so distant from his reality in the outskirts. His eyes fixed on the illuminated entrance of Palazzo Restaurant, from where aromas escaped that made his stomach ache with hunger. "Wait here, Annie. Stay seated on this bench, okay? I'll be back quickly," he said, adjusting the thin coat over his sister's shoulders. The boy took a deep breath, gathering all the courage he had, and walked toward the restaurant. His legs trembled with each step. Upon entering, it was as if he had crossed the border to another world. Crystal chandeliers, impeccably arranged tables, elegant people conversing between wine glasses and sophisticated dishes. Michael felt all eyes turned to him. He tried to make himself small, invisible, while observing the plates, looking for leftovers he could take to Annie. A waiter approached with a severe expression. "What are you doing here, boy?" Before Michael could answer, an elegant young man of approximately 20 years, sitting at the nearest table with friends, intervened. "Look what we have here." "Her gatecrasher," exclaimed Richard Morrison, son of the owner of the city's largest construction company. "Came to get the leftovers, didn't you?" The comment provoked laughter at the table. Michael's face burned with shame, but thinking of Annie, waiting outside gave him the strength not to flee. "Please, sir, my sister is sick and—" "You know what?" interrupted Richard with a malicious smile. "Since you came in here, you'll have to entertain us. How about a song? Sing something for us and maybe you'll earn some coins." The laughter increased. Michael felt tears forming, but held them back. He knew only the songs his mother used to sing when she could still see, simple songs that lulled him to sleep. "We're waiting, street artist," provoked Richard, clapping in rhythm to increase the humiliation. In a secluded corner of the restaurant, a man observed the scene in silence. Anthony Vanderbilt, 68 years old, a publishing industry businessman, widowed for more than a decade, dined alone as he did every night. His tired and attentive eyes didn't miss a single detail of that public humiliation. Michael, with no choice, began to sing with a trembling voice an old lullaby. His voice, initially insecure, gained firmness as he closed his eyes and imagined singing only for Annie. It was a simple melody, but loaded with genuine emotion, the kind that touches the soul with its purity. The restaurant, which before buzzed with conversations and laughter, gradually fell silent. The crystalline voice of the boy, in tune and surprisingly powerful for someone so young, filled the environment. It wasn't a trained or technical voice, but it possessed that rare gift of transmitting true feeling. Richard, who expected a pathetic spectacle to ridicule, saw his plan crumble when he noticed the respectful silence that settled. His expression of disdain transformed into discomfort. When the last note echoed and Michael opened his eyes, he found dozens of gazes fixed on him, some emotional, others surprised, but none with the previous mockery. The silence lasted for a few seconds before discreet applause began. Anthony Vanderbilt was the first to stand up. He walked slowly toward Michael, leaning on his cane. His eyes, blue and deep, studied the boy with intensity. "What's your name, kid?" he asked, with a deep and gentle voice. "Michael, sir." "Well, Michael, you have an extraordinary gift. Where did you learn to sing like that?" "I didn't learn, sir. I just sing what my mother taught me." Anthony nodded, as if confirming something he already suspected. He took some bills from his wallet and extended them to the boy. "Take this. It should help you and your sick sister." Michael looked at the money, hesitant. "Thank you, sir, but it's not charity, boy. It's fair payment for your performance. You provided us with something rare today. Truth in the form of music." Richard, unable to bear seeing his target of mockery receiving attention and approval, stood up. "You're going to believe this story, Anthony. I bet it's just another trick to get money. These street kids are all the same." Anthony turned to Richard with a look that made him step back. "The difference between you, young Morrison, is that he has genuine talent, while you only have your father's name." The comment caused an embarrassing silence. Richard, humiliated, walked out of the restaurant with long strides, but not before casting a look of hatred at Michael. "Where is your sister?" asked Anthony, ignoring the murmurs that were forming. "Outside, sir. She's waiting on the bench." "Let's go get her then. And afterward, I want to meet your mother." Michael hesitated. "My mother can't see, sir. She's blind." Anthony smiled with kindness. "There are many ways to see the world, Michael. Some people see better with their hearts than others do with their eyes." They left the restaurant together. Annie was huddled on the bench, shivering with cold and fever. Upon seeing Michael, she tried to smile, but she was visibly weak. "Is this your sister?" asked Anthony, kneeling with difficulty to be at the little girl's height. "Hello, little one. I'm Anthony." "Hi," replied Annie timidly. "Are you Michael's friend?" "Yes, I'm a new friend, and I want to be friends with both of you and your mother too." Anthony called his driver, who was waiting in the car parked near the restaurant. With care, he helped Annie enter the luxury vehicle, followed by Michael, who still seemed distrustful of that turnaround. "Where are we going, sir?" asked the driver. "First, to the hospital. This girl needs urgent medical attention. Afterward, Michael will show us where his mother lives." During the journey, Anthony observed the siblings. He saw in Michael not just an extraordinary musical talent, but a strength of character rare in someone so young. And looking at Annie, fragile and sick, he felt a lump in his throat. He remembered his own son, Edward, who had departed this world too early, taking with him a part of his soul. The same age that Michael was now. What Anthony didn't know was that that night would forever change the course of many lives. That voice heard by chance in a luxury restaurant would be the beginning of a journey of redemption, forgiveness, and new beginnings, and that young Richard Morrison, wounded in his pride, would not let that public humiliation go without a response. He just didn't imagine how much his obsession with revenge would end up revealing about himself and about secrets kept for years in high New York society. 3 weeks passed since that night at the restaurant. The life of Mrs. Clare and her children had changed drastically. Now they lived in a spacious apartment in the Garden District, property of Anthony Vanderbilt, who had insisted they accept his help while Annie recovered. The girl, after a week of intensive treatment in a private hospital, no longer showed signs of the pneumonia that had almost taken her. Her recovery surprised even the doctors, who attributed the rapid progress to the quality of treatment and care received. That morning, Mrs. Clare felt the furniture in the apartment, still adapting to the new space. At 35 years old, she preserved her serene beauty framed by her long black hair. Her eyes, although without light since the accident that left her blind, maintained a sweet and determined expression. "Michael? Annie?" she called as she approached the kitchen. "We're here, Mom," answered Michael, who was helping his sister finish the breakfast prepared by Margaret, the housekeeper hired by Anthony to assist them. Mrs. Clare smiled, guiding herself by the sound of voices. "Are you already ready for your first day of school?" Michael hesitated. The idea of attending an elite school, where children of the richest families in the city studied, terrified him. He constantly remembered Richard's look of contempt at the restaurant and feared meeting dozens of others like him. "I don't know. If I want to go, Mum," he finally confessed. "What if the children there don't like us?" Mrs. Clare sat next to her son, finding his hand with surprising precision. "Michael, remember what I always say. A person's worth isn't in what they possess, but in who they are. You are wonderful children, and whoever doesn't see that is missing the opportunity to know special people." Anthony arrived at that moment, after knocking lightly on the half-open door of the apartment. "Good morning, everyone," he greeted with the deep voice that had already become familiar and comforting to the family. "Mr. Anthony!" exclaimed Annie, running to hug him. The little girl had developed an immense affection for the businessman, who always brought small gifts and treated her with genuine affection. "How is my little singer today?" he asked, lifting her in his arms carefully. At 68 years old, Anthony remained active and strong, despite his completely white hair and the wrinkles that marked his face. "I'm nervous about the new school," confessed Annie. "It's normal to feel that way," he said, placing her back on the ground. "But I'm sure everyone will love you both." He then turned to Mrs. Clare, who had stood up upon hearing his voice. "Good morning, Claire. I hope I'm not bothering you so early." "Not at all," she responded, with a shy smile. "Your presence is always welcome." There was a silent connection between them that grew each day. Anthony admired the strength and dignity of that woman who even in adversity had raised such special children. Claire, in turn, felt increasingly comfortable in his presence, a man who treated her condition with naturalness and respect. "I came to accompany you to the school," explained Anthony. "I thought it would be good to be with a familiar face on the first day." While the children finished getting ready, Anthony and Claire conversed in the living room. He told about his plans to enroll Michael in singing classes with one of the best teachers in the country. "Your son has a rare gift, Claire. A voice that not only emits perfect notes, but transmits genuine emotion. That can't be taught." "He takes after his father," she commented, with a slight tone of sadness. "Robert always had a beautiful voice. It's what enchanted me when we met." "And where is he now?" asked Anthony cautiously. Claire sighed. "I don't know. When I lost my vision in the accident, he stayed for a few months. Then he simply left. Said he couldn't take care of a blind wife and 2 small children." Indignation appeared on Anthony's face, but he contained himself. He didn't know how to recognize the extraordinary woman he had by his side. The comment made Claire blush, turning her face to hide the effect those words had on her. Meanwhile, in the penthouse of one of the most luxurious buildings in the city, Richard Morrison had coffee with his father, the powerful businessman Paul Morrison. A 55-year-old man, known for his coldness in business and for the empire he had built in the construction industry. "So Anthony Vanderbilt has adopted a family of beggars," commented Paul, reading the news in a social column newspaper. "I always knew that old man went disturbed after his son and wife died." Richard stirred his coffee thoughtfully. "He humiliated me at the palazzo, Dad, in front of all my friends." Paul faced his son with severity. "And what were you doing provoking? Sir, street boy, haven't I taught you that you don't dirty your hands with that kind of people?" The kid invaded the restaurant. "He was asking for leftovers," Richard defended himself. "Still, you gave ammunition for Anthony to play the hero. Now everyone is commenting about the great businessman with a generous heart and his protégé with the voice of an angel." Paul threw the newspaper on the table. "And guess who seems like the villain of the story?" Richard swallowed hard. Since childhood, he had learned that disappointing his father was the worst mistake he could make. Paul never used physical violence, but his words cut deeper than any blow. "I'll fix this, Dad." "You better. Our family can't be associated with this type of behavior. We have a reputation to uphold." In truth, Paul Morrison was more bothered by the closeness between Anthony and Michael's family for other reasons. There was a past between the two businessmen that few knew about, secrets buried nearly 2 decades ago that, if revealed, could destroy the reputation he so prized. Meanwhile, Michael and Annie arrived at Athena Academy, one of the most prestigious educational institutions in the city. The imposing neoclassical building intimidated even adults. For two children from the outskirts, it was like entering a palace. "Remember," said Anthony before they said goodbye, "you deserve to be here as much as anyone. Never feel less because of where you came from." The words sounded reassuring, but didn't prevent Michael's nervousness upon entering the fifth-grade classroom. 30 pairs of curious eyes evaluated him from head to toe, noting his new but simple clothes, his shy posture, his frightened look. The teacher, Ms. Eliza, a woman of approximately 40 years with a gentle expression, introduced him to the class. "This is Michael Oliveira, our new colleague. I hope everyone welcomes him well and helps him integrate." A girl with red hair and freckles raised her hand. "Teacher, is it true that he's the boy that Mr. Vanderbilt adopted? The one who sings?" Michael felt his face burn, so they already knew about him. "Marina, we shouldn't ask that kind of question," Miss Eliza gently reprimanded. "Michael is our colleague now and deserves respect, like all of you." "But I saw it in the newspaper," insisted another student. "It said he lived on the street and now he's rich." "I didn't live on the street," Michael defended himself, finding courage amid the embarrassment. "We had a house. Small, but it was our house." The murmuring increased. Some whispered, others stared at him with almost scientific curiosity, as if he were a rare species on display. "Silence, please," intervened the teacher. "Michael, you can sit at that empty desk next to B." The indicated girl, with black skin and curly hair tied in a ponytail, smiled shyly at him. It was the only genuine smile he received that morning. During the break, Michael looked for Annie in the courtyard. He found her sitting alone on a bench, watching the other children play. "Are you okay?" he asked, sitting beside her. She nodded, but her eyes revealed sadness. "Nobody wants to play with me. A girl said she doesn't mix with adopted charity cases." Michael felt a wave of anger, but breathed deeply as his mother had always taught. "It doesn't matter what they say, Annie. We are who we are, and that doesn't change because of others." He was interrupted by B, the classmate who had smiled at him in the classroom. "Hi, can I sit with you?" she asked, carrying her colorful lunchbox. "Sure," replied Michael, surprised and relieved by that gesture of friendship. "I'm B, and you must be Annie, right? Michael talked about you in math class." Annie smiled, instantly liking that girl, with an easy smile and sincere look. "Don't pay attention to what others say," continued B, offering a cookie to each one. "My dad says that people who judge others without knowing them are just showing their own ignorance." At that moment, a group of boys approached, led by Gus, a blonde boy with an arrogant expression. "Look, the scholarship student is now friends with the beggars," he provoked, drawing laughter from the others. B stood up, facing him without fear. "At least I know how to choose friends by character, not by the size of their parents' bank account." "Defend them, Beatrice. After all, you don't belong in this place either," retorted Gus with malice. "My dad said your dad is only in this school because he got a scholarship after an accident that left him crippled." B's face hardened, but before she could respond, an adult voice interrupted the discussion. "What's happening here?" asked Principal Ramirez, approaching with a severe expression. "Nothing, Principal Ramirez," Gus quickly answered, completely changing his tone. "We were just introducing ourselves to the new students." The principal looked from one face to another, clearly perceiving the tension. "Well, I hope you're being hospitable. Diversity enriches our school, and we hope everyone understands that." When the principal walked away, Gus cast a final look of contempt at the trio before leaving with his friends. "Who is he?" asked Michael. "Gus Morrison, son of Paul Morrison, owner of the largest construction company in the country," explained B. "He thinks he owns the school because his father donates millions every year." "Morrison?" Michael felt a chill. "Is he related to Richard Morrison?" "He's the younger brother." "Why? Do you know Richard?" Michael didn't immediately respond, remembering the humiliation at the restaurant and the hateful look Richard had cast. Him when leaving. "I met him once," he finally said. "It wasn't a pleasant experience." What Michael didn't know was that, at that exact moment, Richard Morrison was entering Anthony Vanderbilt's office with a cordial smile that didn't reach his eyes, and that the conversation they would have there would be the beginning of a silent war that would threaten everything that Michael and his family were beginning to build. The afternoon sun rays entered through the wide windows of Anthony Vanderbilt's office on the 20th floor of one of the most imposing buildings on Fifth Avenue. The businessman observed the city below, thoughtful, when his secretary announced through the intercom, "Mr. Vanderbilt, Richard Morrison is here to see you." Anthony frowned, surprised by the unexpected visit. "Send him in, Vera." Richard entered, with the typical confidence of someone who grew up believing the world belonged to him. He wore an impeccable suit and brought a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Anthony, what a pleasure to see you again," he greeted, extending his hand. "To what do I owe the visit, Richard?" asked Anthony, dispensing with formalities while indicating a chair. Richard sat down, studying the office with apparent admiration. "I came to apologize for the incident at the restaurant. My behavior was inappropriate." Anthony raised his eyebrows, skeptical. 3 weeks later. "I admit my pride prevented me from coming sooner," replied Richard, with false humility. "But what you did for that boy and his family is admirable. I'd like to contribute somehow, perhaps with a donation to some institution that helps children in similar situations." Anthony observed the young man with attention. He knew well that type of falsity, common in the business circles where he had navigated for decades. "I appreciate the gesture, Richard, but Michael and his family are not a charity project. They are people for whom I've developed genuine affection." Richard smiled, a calculating gleam in his eyes. "Of course, I understand perfectly. It must be comforting to have a family again after everything that happened with your son." The mention of Edward made Anthony stiffen. Few dared to touch on that subject in his presence. "What do you know about my son, Richard?" "Just what everyone knows, the tragic accident that took him, along with your wife Helen." Richard made a studied pause. "It must have been devastating, to lose a disabled son so abruptly." Anthony stood up, his expression hardened. "I think our conversation is over." Richard also rose, feigning surprise. "Did I say something wrong? I apologize if I touched on a sensitive subject." "No, Richard, you didn't say anything wrong. You just revealed your true purpose in coming here, and it wasn't to apologize." Young Morrison smiled, abandoning the facade. "Always straight to the point, aren't you? I admire that about you, Anthony. Too bad my father doesn't share that admiration." "Paul always had problems with integrity," replied Anthony coldly. "I hope you haven't inherited all his characteristics." "Actually, I inherited the best ones, determination and memory. I never forget an insult or a secret." With those enigmatic words, Richard withdrew, leaving in the air a veiled threat that disturbed Anthony more than he would have liked to admit. That same afternoon, at Athena Academy, Michael faced his own challenges. During music class, teacher Olivia asked each student to present a brief vocal or instrumental performance. "Michael, I heard you sing very well," she commented, smiling encouragingly. "Would you like to show us?" All eyes turned to him, some curious, others skeptical, some clearly hostile. Michael felt his heart accelerate. It was different to sing spontaneously for his family or forced by humiliation at the restaurant. Here there was expectation. "I don't know if I should," he hesitated. "Go on, Michael," encouraged Bea, who sat near him. "Show them." Taking a deep breath, Michael stood up and walked to the front of the class. He closed his eyes for a moment, seeking courage, and then began to sing a simple song, a popular melody that his mother used to sing. His voice, initially timid, soon filled the room with a purity and emotion that silenced even the most skeptical. Teacher Olivia watched with wide eyes, clearly impressed by the boy's natural talent. When he finished, there was a moment of stunned silence before the room exploded in enthusiastic applause. Even Gus Morrison seemed surprised, though he tried to hide it. "Michael, that was extraordinary," praised the teacher, visibly moved. "You have a very special gift." As he returned to his place under the admiring gaze of his classmates, Michael felt a mixture of pride and relief. For the first time since arriving at that school, he felt that maybe he could find his place. At the end of that day, while they waited for Anthony to pick them up, Michael, Annie and Bea chatted animatedly about the day's events. Michael's presentation had changed the atmosphere, making some classmates more friendly and curious. "My dad will love to meet you," said Bea enthusiastically. "He's a literature professor at the university and loves music." "How did his accident happen?" asked Annie innocently, remembering Gus's malicious comment about Bea's father being crippled. Bea hesitated only for an instant. "It was a car accident 3 years ago. A drunk driver hit the taxi we were in. Dad lost the movement. In his legs and Mom..." Her voice failed. "Mom didn't make it." Michael and Annie fell silent, understanding the pain behind those words. "I'm sorry," murmured Annie, holding her new friend's hand. Bea smiled sadly. "It's okay. Now it's just me and Dad, but we manage well. He got a scholarship for me at this school after he published a book that was very successful." At that moment, Anthony's car parked in front of the school. Michael noticed that the businessman seemed worried, despite the smile he opened upon seeing them. "How was the first day?" he asked after the children entered the vehicle. While Michael and Annie related their experiences, Anthony listened attentively, but his thoughts seemed distant. Richard Morrison's visit had disturbed him more than he wanted to admit. "Mr. Anthony, this is our friend Bea," introduced Annie, pulling the businessman back to the present. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Bea," he responded, smiling at the girl. "I'm glad Michael and Annie found a friend so quickly." "Could you give Bea a ride?" asked Michael. "She lives near our apartment." "Of course, it would be my pleasure." During the journey, Anthony observed through the rearview mirror the 3 children chatting animatedly. There was something comforting in that scene, something that momentarily filled the emptiness he had carried for so many years. When they arrived at the building where Bea lived with her father, a modest but well-maintained building, Anthony insisted on accompanying her to the apartment. "Dad must be working on his new book," explained Bea as they went up in the elevator. "He gets easily distracted when he's writing." Upon opening the door, they were greeted by Frank Adams, a man of approximately 45 years, with an intellectual appearance, sitting in a wheelchair in front of a computer. "Bea, darling, and I see you brought friends," he exclaimed, turning the chair to receive them. "Dad, these are Michael and Annie, my new friends from school. And this is Mr. Vanderbilt, who gave me a ride." Frank widened his eyes upon recognizing the businessman. "Anthony Vanderbilt? It's an honor to meet you, sir. I'm a great admirer of your work in the publishing market." Anthony smiled, shaking Frank's extended hand. "The pleasure is mine. Bea told us you're a literature professor and writer." "Yes, although the professor has been put on temporary pause since the accident," explained Frank with a touch of melancholy. "Now I dedicate myself entirely to writing." The 2 men continued talking, discovering common interests in the literary world. Before saying goodbye, Anthony extended an invitation. "Frank, I'd like to invite you along with Bea for dinner at my house next Saturday. Claire and the children would love it, and I confess it would be a pleasure to talk more about literature with someone who really understands the subject." Frank promptly accepted, visibly honored by the invitation. Upon returning to the Garden District apartment, they found Mrs. Clare on the living room sofa, listening to a psychology audiobook. Since Anthony discovered her interest in the area, he had provided a vast collection of accessible materials for her. "How was the first day of school?" she asked, turning off the device upon noticing the arrival of her children. While the children animatedly related the day's events, Anthony observed Claire with admiration. In just 3 weeks she had blossomed, recovering the confidence that blindness and abandonment had shaken. She had begun an online psychology course, determined to build a new career that didn't depend on vision. "We met a new friend, Bea," told Annie, "and her dad is coming to dinner here on Saturday." Claire smiled. "How wonderful. I'll need to think of a special menu." "Don't worry about that," intervened Anthony. "Margaret will take care of everything. You just need to be the charming hostess that you naturally are." The comment made Claire blush, a delicate flush that Anthony found adorable, even knowing she couldn't see his expression of admiration. Later, after the children went to sleep, Anthony invited Claire for a conversation on the terrace. The night was mild, and the city lights created a stunning panorama that only he could see. "There's something worrying me, Claire," he finally confessed. "Today I received an unexpected visit from Richard Morrison." Claire frowned, recognizing the name of the man who had humiliated Michael at the restaurant. What did he want? Apparently to apologize, but I felt there was something more, something threatening. What kind of threat? Anthony hesitated. He didn't want to worry her unnecessarily, but felt he needed to share his concern. "He mentioned my son, Edward, in a disturbing way." Claire extended her hand, finding his with surprising precision. "You never told me about your son." Anthony took a deep breath, feeling the weight of memories he rarely shared. Edward was born with a rare condition, a form of cerebral palsy. The doctors said he wouldn't live long, but he fought bravely for 8 years. His voice failed. "Helen, my wife, dedicated every minute of her life to him. We were happy despite the challenges until that trip." Claire squeezed his hand, encouraging him to continue. "We were returning from an experimental treatment in New York. It was night. It was raining heavily. The driver lost control on the highway. The car fell into a ravine." "Oh, Anthony." "I was in a business meeting abroad. When I found out, it was already too late. I lost them both at once." Claire remained silent, respecting the magnitude of that pain. "What intrigues me," continued Anthony, "is how Richard knew about Edward's disability. It wasn't something we publicized at the time, and he was very young when it all happened." "Maybe he heard it from someone," suggested Claire. "Maybe. But the way he spoke, it seemed to insinuate there's more to the story than I know." At that same moment, in a luxurious hotel suite, Richard Morrison met with a middle-aged woman with a severe appearance and calculating look. "Nurse Monica, thank you for coming so quickly," he said, serving her a glass of expensive wine. "Your call intrigued me, Mr. Morrison. It's been many years since I worked for your family." Richard smiled, sitting across from her. "That's exactly why I sought you out. You worked in Anthony Vanderbilt's house during the period when his son was alive, isn't that right?" Monica nodded slowly, her eyes narrowing. "Yes, I took care of little Edward for almost 5 years. A sad case." "And were you there on the day of the accident?" "No, I had been dismissed a few months earlier." She took a sip of wine. "Why this sudden interest?" Richard leaned forward, his gaze intense. "Let's say I'm collecting information to correct an injustice. And I believe you may have important pieces of this puzzle." "What kind of information?" "About Edward Vanderbilt, about the accident, about strange coincidences." Monica placed the glass on the table, suddenly tense. "There are things that are better left buried, Mr. Morrison." "I'm willing to pay very well for your memories, Nurse Monica, and for your cooperation in what comes next." The silence that followed was loaded with tension. Finally, Monica spoke, her voice now a tone lower. "What exactly do you want to know about that night?" In the Garden District apartment, Michael couldn't sleep. He got up silently and went to the window, observing the illuminated city. He thought about everything that had happened in the last few weeks, the turnaround his life had taken. He felt grateful, but also apprehensive, as if something threatening loomed on the horizon. Perhaps it was just the natural fear of someone who had always lived in uncertainty, fearing that the newly discovered happiness could disappear as suddenly as it had arrived. What Michael didn't know was that his intuition was correct, and that the secrets of the past, long buried, were about to emerge, threatening to destroy the fragile happiness they were beginning to build. The Saturday dinner at Anthony Vanderbilt's house transformed into a tradition in the following weeks. Frank and Bea became a constant presence, and a genuine friendship blossomed between the two families. For Michael, it was as if a new world was opening up. At school, his extraordinary voice had won admiration, softening the initial hostility. The singing lessons with Maestro Julian, an eccentric and demanding man whom Anthony had hired, were molding his raw talent into something even more impressive. "Breathe from the diaphragm, boy. The voice is born here, not in the throat," instructed the maestro, pressing Michael's abdomen during vocal exercises. Michael learned quickly, absorbing each lesson with the dedication of someone who had found his true passion. In just 1 month, his technique had evolved in a surprising way. Although Maestro Julian insisted that the true treasure continued to be the genuine emotion he transmitted when singing. Technique anyone can learn with time and discipline, he would say. But making the listener feel what you feel, that's a gift, Michael. Never lose it. Mrs. Clare also blossomed. Her psychology course was advancing rapidly, and she had discovered a natural ability to understand others' emotions. When you lose one sense, the others sharpen, she explained. Perhaps I hear more deeply now, perceive nuances that before would go unnoticed. The friendship between Claire and Frank grew with each meeting. They shared the experience of overcoming physical limitations and raising children alone. Anthony observed with a mixture of joy and a twinge of something that took him time to recognize as jealousy. On a Sunday afternoon, while the children played in the garden of Anthony's mansion in Hillcrest, where they had recently moved, Claire and Frank conversed animatedly about literature on the porch. Anthony observed them from a distance, thoughtful. "They make a beautiful pair, don't they?" commented Margaret, the housekeeper, while serving tea. Anthony smiled with sadness. "Yes, they do, both young, intelligent, with similar stories of overcoming." "And you? Don't you think you deserve a second chance at love?" The question caught Anthony by surprise. Margaret, who had served him for more than 20 years, was one of the few people with whom he maintained a relationship of sufficient trust for such conversations. "I don't know if I still have that right, Margaret. Not after—" He was interrupted by the sound of the intercom. The security guard announced the arrival of an unexpected visitor, Richard Morrison. "What does he want now?" murmured Anthony, tense. "Should I say you're not here?" suggested Margaret. "No. It's better to face whatever it is right away." Richard arrived at the porch with the same arrogant posture as always, but there was something different in his look, a disturbing confidence, like someone holding winning cards. "Anthony, what an idyllic scene!" he exclaimed, observing the garden where the children played. "The perfect family you built from nothing." "What do you want, Richard?" asked Anthony, without beating around the bush. The young man smiled, taking an envelope from the inside pocket of his jacket. "Just to deliver this personally. I believe you'll find it revealing." Anthony took the envelope with caution. Richard made a small, ironic bow. "I won't take more of your time. Enjoy your Sunday with family while you can." When Richard withdrew, Anthony opened the envelope with slightly trembling fingers. Inside were some old photographs and yellowed newspaper clippings. Upon examining the content, his face paled. "Is everything okay, Anthony?" asked Claire, who had perceived his agitation even without seeing. "Yes, just business matters," he lied, quickly putting away the envelope. "Nothing to worry about." But Claire, with her sharpened sensitivity, perceived the tension in his voice. "Are you sure? You seem disturbed." "Just tired," he insisted, forcing a smile that she couldn't see but could feel the falsity of. That night, after everyone retired, Anthony locked himself in his office, spreading the contents of the envelope. On the desk, photographs of little Edward, clippings about the accident, medical records that should be confidential, and an anonymous letter suggesting that the official version of the tragedy that had victimized Helen and Edward hid a much darker truth. "How did he get this?" murmured Anthony, running his hands through his graying hair. The past he had tried to bury for so many years now threatened to resurface, bringing with it ghosts that could destroy everything he had built with Michael, Annie, and Claire. The next morning, upon going down for breakfast, he found Michael already awake, practicing. "Vocal scales in the music room. Early riser today, huh?" he commented, trying to appear normal despite the sleepless night. Michael smiled. "Maestro Julian says that great singers take advantage of the morning's fresh air to train." Anthony sat at the piano, fingering some notes to accompany the boy. For a moment he lost himself in the music, forgetting his worries. "Anthony," called Michael after finishing the exercise, "can I ask something?" "Of course. Why does Richard Morrison hate us so much?" "Yesterday he was observing us from afar, with a strange look." Anthony hesitated. Richard has problems with any person he considers socially inferior. It's nothing personal. It seems personal, insisted Michael, especially with you. Sighing, Anthony closed the piano lid. There are old stories between families that sometimes affect subsequent generations, Michael. Complicated things that children shouldn't have to deal with. I'm not a child anymore, protested Michael. I've already been through things that many adults have never faced. Anthony smiled sadly, recognizing the truth in those words. You're right, I promise that one day I'll tell you everything. But for now, focus on your music and studies. The rest, leave it to me. What Anthony didn't know was that the wheels set in motion by Richard could no longer be stopped. That same morning, young Morrison met with his father and nurse Monica in his office. Are you absolutely certain of what you're claiming? Asked Paul Morrison, studying the documents in front of him. This is extremely serious. Monica nodded. I worked in the Vanderbilt house for years. Little Edward had a delicate but stable condition. That sudden trip, and I always found it strange. And there was no body to identify, added Richard. Only the wife's documents were found in the accident. Paul leaned back in his chair, thoughtful. What do you intend to do with this information, Richard? Destroy Anthony Vanderbilt, Dad. The same way he tried to destroy us 20 years ago, when he denounced your irregularities in the construction of that mall. That was business, argued Paul. This is messing with a family's memory. Since when do you have scruples? Questioned Richard, surprised. You yourself taught me that in the business world, only the ruthless survive. Paul studied his son with a somber expression. There are limits, Richard, even for men like us. Well, it's already too late, declared Richard, standing up. The story is already in the hands of the press. Tomorrow everyone will know that the great Anthony Vanderbilt possibly faked the death of his own disabled son. Meanwhile, at Athena Academy, Michael faced his own challenges. Gus Morrison, clearly instructed by his older brother, had intensified the bullying in recent weeks. So adopted orphan? Ready for the talent festival? He provoked during the break. I heard you're going to sing a special song for your foster daddy. Michael breathed deeply, controlling his anger. At least I have talent to show, Gus. What do you have besides your father's money? The response hit the target. Gus advanced, but was restrained by Bea, who appeared at Michael's side. Careful, Morrison, she warned. Any problem with Michael and the principal will know about that cheating on the math test. Gus backed off, casting a look of hatred. You'll regret this, very soon. That afternoon, while everyone dined at the mansion, the telephone rang. Margaret answered and, with a worried expression, called Anthony for an urgent call. Minutes. Later, he returned to the dining room, visibly shaken. Did something happen? Asked Claire, perceiving the change in his energy. Just a situation in business, he responded, avoiding details. Nothing important. But later that night, when everyone was asleep, Anthony confronted reality in his office with a half-empty bottle of whiskey. The call had been from his press advisor, alerting about a devastating report that would be published the next morning. Businessman faked disabled son's death. The story, based on exclusive documents and the testimony of a former family nurse, suggested that Anthony, unable to deal with his son's disability, had abandoned the child in an institution abroad, faking his death along with his wife's in an accident. How could they? He murmured, holding his head in his hands. The absurdity of the accusation left him stunned, but he knew how devastating it would be for his reputation and worse for Michael, Annie, and Claire. He was interrupted by a soft knock on the door. It was Michael in pajamas with a worried expression. Anthony, is everything okay? I saw the light on. The businessman tried to disguise his state, hiding the bottle. Just work that's behind, Michael. Go back to bed. But the boy, with the sharp intuition of someone who had grown up facing difficulties, realized that something serious was happening. It's because of Richard, isn't it? What is he doing against us? Anthony hesitated, divided between protecting the boy and recognizing his maturity. Finally, he indicated the chair in front of him. Sit down, Michael. I think it's time you know a story. The story of my son, Edward. During the following hour, Anthony related everything. Edward's birth with severe cerebral palsy, the years of dedication, the unconditional love that he and Helen nurtured for their son, despite the challenges. He told about the trip in search of an experimental treatment, the fatal accident on the highway, the devastation he felt upon losing them both at once. Edward was my world, Michael. I would never abandon him or deny his existence. On the contrary, he taught me the true meaning of love. Michael listened. To everything in silence, his eyes watery. Then why is Richard doing this? Why invent such a cruel story? Revenge. Against me and by extension against all who matter to me, including you. But why? Anthony sighed. Years ago, I denounced serious irregularities in constructions by his father's company. A mall partially collapsed due to low-quality materials, injuring dozens of people. Paul Morrison almost went bankrupt and to prison. He never forgave me for exposing the truth. And now the son wants revenge, concluded Michael, demonstrating understanding beyond his years. Exactly. What are we going to do? Anthony smiled with sadness. There's not much to do. The report will come out tomorrow. My reputation will be destroyed, and I fear that you will suffer the consequences. Michael remained silent for a few moments, processing everything. Then, with surprising determination, he spoke. The truth doesn't need proof, Anthony. It has its own strength. What do you mean? If Richard is going to tell lies about you in the press, let's tell the truth to everyone. The next morning, when the scandalous article adorned the front pages of newspapers, the mansion's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Reporters crowded at the gates, clamoring for statements. Anthony gathered Claire, Michael, and Annie in the living room. I need to tell you something serious, he began, relating the false accusations now circulating. Claire covered her mouth, horrified. Annie cried, frightened by the cruelty of the story. I'll face this alone, declared Anthony. Perhaps it would be better for you to return temporarily to your old apartment until— No, interrupted Claire with surprising firmness. We won't abandon you when you most need support. But your reputation, the children— Our reputation is linked to yours now, she insisted, and fleeing would be admitting guilt. Michael stood up with determination in his gaze. I have an idea. That afternoon, a press conference was convened at the Vanderbilt mansion. Journalists from all media outlets attended, expecting the scandal of the year. Instead, they found Anthony serene, flanked by Claire, Michael, Annie, and surprisingly Frank and Bea. I thank everyone for their presence, Anthony began. I've been accused of something monstrous, faking the death of my own son out of shame for his disability. I could simply deny it and sue those responsible, but I prefer to respond with the complete truth. With a choked but firm voice, he related Edward's story, showing preserved photographs and videos that documented the family's love and dedication. He presented doctors who had treated the boy, official documents of the accident, the expert report from the highway police. My son is not alive somewhere, as they suggest. He departed 15 years ago, along with my wife Helen, in a devastating accident that almost destroyed my will to live. Claire took his hand, giving him strength to continue. But recently, life gave me a second chance, continued Anthony. Through Michael, Annie, and Claire, I rediscovered the meaning of family, of unconditional love, not to replace those I lost, but to honor their memory by living fully again. It was then that Michael advanced to the microphone. With impressive composure for his 10 years, he looked directly at the cameras. I wanted to say something to whoever invented this cruel story about the man who saved my family. The truth needs no justifications. It exists on its own, like music. And then, without warning, he began to sing. Not a rehearsed or technical song, but a simple and powerful melody he had composed in recent weeks, inspired by his own journey and Anthony's. A song about loss, new beginnings, and the family we build beyond blood ties. His voice, now trained by Maestro Julian, but preserving the genuine emotion that had always characterized it, silenced the auditorium. Some journalists openly wept. The cameras captured that extraordinary moment when art transcended cruelty and lies. When the last note echoed, silence persisted for several seconds before a spontaneous ovation filled the environment. The press conference transformed into the opposite of what Richard had planned. Instead of destroying Anthony, it elevated him to a new level of public admiration. The next day's newspapers didn't speak of the fabricated scandal, but of the moving story of overcoming, the touching music, the reconstructed family. Nurse Monica, confronted with irrefutable evidence and pressured by public opinion, ended up confessing she had been paid to distort the facts. Her confession led directly to Richard Morrison. Paul Morrison, upon seeing his son exposed as a manipulator, took a drastic decision. He publicly disinherited him, declaring that, even in the most aggressive business, there are limits that should not be crossed. Richard, abandoned by his father and socially isolated, suddenly found himself without the power and influence he so prized. The young man who had built his identity on inherited privileges now faced the consequences of his own actions. Anthony, however, surprised everyone by refusing to prosecute Richard criminally. "Revenge only perpetuates the cycle of hurt," he explained when questioned. "I prefer to use this painful experience for something constructive." 6 months later, in a packed theater in downtown New York, Michael gave his first formal presentation as a soloist, accompanied by a professional orchestra. In the program, a new initiative was announced, the Edward Vanderbilt Institute for SOAR, special children, dedicated to providing treatment, education, and support for families with children with disabilities. Mrs. Clare, now with her psychology degree almost completed, would coordinate the Department of Emotional Support for families. Frank would be responsible for the educational area, developing methods adapted for different needs. Backstage before the presentation, Anthony adjusted Michael's tie, who seemed nervous for the first time in a long time. "What if I miss a note?" asked the boy. Anthony smiled. "Maestro Julian would say that anyone can sing perfect notes with enough training, but making people feel something true, that's your special gift, Michael." "Do you think Edward would be proud of all this?" The question caught Anthony by surprise but touched him deeply. "I'm certain he would. Edward taught me that true love transcends limits, even life and death. In a way, he united us, even without being physically present." From a discreet seat in the last row of the theater, Richard Morrison observed everything. 6 months of isolation and forced reflection had begun to change something inside him. He wasn't ready to ask for forgiveness. Perhaps he never would be. But he felt a genuine curiosity about that improvised family that had withstood the storm he had tried to create. When the lights dimmed and Michael appeared on stage, a wave of applause filled the theater. The frail boy from the restaurant now carried himself with quiet confidence, as if he belonged in that place, as if his whole life had prepared him for this moment. At the first chords of the orchestra, he breathed deeply, as Maestro Julian had taught. His gaze found Anthony, Claire, and Annie in the first row. Beside them, Frank and Bea smiled encouragingly. It was his family now, not of blood, but of choice and love. And then Michael began to sing. The music, titled "The Nest," narrated the journey of a small bird that loses its home in the storm, but finds unexpected shelter among birds of another species. A simple but profound metaphor about family, belonging, and new beginnings. His voice, now technically impeccable, but preserving the raw emotion that made him unique, rose through the air of the theater, touching each person present in a different way. For some, it was a story of overcoming, for others of redemption. For Richard, observing from the shadows, it was a painful mirror of his own choices. When the last note echoed and the reverent silence transformed into enthusiastic applause, Michael smiled. He was no longer the frightened boy who had entered the restaurant looking for leftovers. He was an artist, a son, a brother, someone who had found his place in the world. In the following months, the Edward Vanderbilt Institute became a national reference in the treatment of children with disabilities. Mrs. Clare, now graduated in psychology, developed pioneering work in emotional support for families. Annie, completely recovered, excelled in her studies and dreamed of becoming a doctor. Anthony, observing that family that destiny had granted him, felt a peace he hadn't experienced since before the tragedy. The emptiness left by Edward and Helen would never be completely filled, but he had learned that the human heart has an infinite capacity to love again. One afternoon, while working in his home office, he received an unexpected visit. It was Richard Morrison. "May I come in?" asked the young man, visibly uncomfortable. Anthony hesitated but nodded. "What do you want, Richard?" The young man, once arrogant and confident, now seemed diminished, as if the weight of his actions had physically shrunk him. "I didn't come to ask for forgiveness," he began. "I don't think I deserve it." "Then why are you here?" Richard took a deep breath. "To understand. How could someone who lost everything like you not let himself be consumed by hatred? How did you manage to build something so beautiful from pain?" Anthony studied the young man for a long moment. "You know, Richard, pain can be a cruel master or a wise guide. The choice is ours." "My father disinherited me," confessed Richard. "I'm alone for the first time in my life. And how do you feel?" "Lost. But maybe that's what I needed, to discover who I am without the money, without the Morrison name." Anthony nodded, understanding. "The Institute needs volunteers, people willing to work hard, without privileges." "Interested?" Richard widened his eyes, surprised by the offer. "After everything I did?" "Precisely because of what you did," replied Anthony. "True redemption doesn't come from words, but from actions." In the music room next door, Michael practiced a new composition on the piano. The soft notes traveled through the walls, creating a perfect soundtrack for that moment of new beginning. Richard listened in silence, letting the music penetrate places in his soul he had never explored. Perhaps as Michael had sung in The Nest, it was never too late to find a new home, to build bridges instead of walls. A year later, on the anniversary of the Institute's inauguration, Michael presented a complete symphony, his first composition, for orchestra. The packed theater applauded standing when the now 12-year-old teenager personally conducted the final piece, titled Reconstruction. In the first row, Anthony, Claire, now officially his wife, Annie, Frank, B, and, surprisingly, Richard applauded emotionally. One seat remained empty, symbolically reserved for Edward, not as a painful reminder, but as an eternal presence of love that somehow had guided all of them to that point. As the last notes of the symphony echoed through the theater, Michael looked at that unlikely family that destiny had given him. A businessman who had lost everything and rebuilt his life, a blind mother who saw with her heart, a writer in a wheelchair who created worlds without borders, a sister who had overcome illness and dreamed of healing others, a friend who had defended him when no one else had. And even a former enemy who slowly was learning the value of humility and forgiveness. It was a family built not by blood, but by daily choices of love, respect, and understanding. A nest woven with the threads of shared experiences, of overcome, pains of multiplied joys. And Michael, the boy who had once sung out of fear and hunger in a luxury restaurant, now sang by choice and passion on the country's biggest stages. His voice, which before carried only the weight of survival, now elevated hearts and minds with messages of hope and renewal. Music, that gift that had emerged from the most basic need, had become his way of transforming the world, of touching souls, of building bridges over abysses of social differences and prejudices. At the end of the presentation, when the applause finally ceased, Michael took the microphone for a brief speech. Music, like life, is not made only of perfect notes, but of pauses, of breaths, of errors that teach us and silences that make us listen more deeply. Thank you to everyone who has been part of this journey of new beginnings and discoveries. Our symphony continues, every day, in each gesture of love and hope. Dear listeners, we hope that the story of Michael and his family has touched your hearts. To continue this emotional journey, we've prepared a special playlist with equally captivating stories. Find it here, clicking to the left. If this narrative moved you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and leave your like on the video. Daily, we bring unique stories that explore the complexity of life, with characters who face challenges and find strength to begin again. Share in the comments your own stories of